This seems like the right time of year to talk a little bit about the evil I sometimes see in the world and sometimes in myself. Welcome back to the 50/50 Project, where every week I talk through an item on a list made up of one thing I've learned for each year I've lived. This week we're making a stop in the spiritual category for thing number 30. Don't get glib about the forces of evil. Don't do it. Don't get glib. Fall has come to downtown Indianapolis, and the leaves on the little trees in front of the cathedral have gone gold and bronze. Outside, the afternoon shadows in the valley between our high rises seem to be deeper. The nights come a little earlier, and it's just a few days before Halloween as I record this. So, this seems like a fitting moment to tackle a little bit of a darker topic. So, one of the things I think I'm going to be doing to get myself into the Halloween spirit this year is to binge the final season of one of my very favorite shows, which is actually just called Evil. It's a smart, spooky, funny, actually bonkers show that follows a ragtag team of do gooders, some of whom are religious and some secular, some really superstitious, and others highly skeptical about the supernatural as they fight evil. And they fight all kinds of evil, actually. The show kind of leaves it open to debate about whether the supernatural stuff is supposed to present as real or not, but it makes it clear that we are surrounded by all kinds of indisputable, clearly present evil in our time. Human psychology, modern technology, injustice, inequity, bias, greed. It's all there in this show, competing with the demonic for screen time. I think a lot of us like these kinds of shows, stories that at least brush up against the Hollywood version of evil, flickering lights and disembodied voices, flashy kinds of terror. I think most of us just kind of like to be scared now and then. Maybe it's just the excitement, or maybe it's a way to contrast the scary stuff with the mundane and remind ourselves of how safe we really are most of the time. But I think we also like a formula that makes us feel less alone and less impotent in the face of evil. I can think of other shows like this. Buffy the Vampire immediately comes to mind, and they're often big ensemble casts. The characters aren't left alone with evil, they band together into a chosen family, and the solace of those close relationships, I think, kind of mitigates the heaviness of anything scary that's going on. So they come together, they hone their fighting skills, they coalesce into a kind of army, and they go from being alone and afraid to being united against a common foe. And this kind of community makes even the most terrifying enemy manageable. There's a show like that called Penny Dreadful, which I think was on Showtime, maybe. So that's another example of a genre. And come to think of it, and in a slightly different way, there's this batshit brilliant British horror slash police procedural show called Whitechapel, which also is a really good example of that genre. Although now that I think about it, they put a cliffhanger at the end of a really crazy season and then just never came back into production. So, maybe don't fall in love with Whitechapel. And actually, I'm now thinking too of this really wild movie from the early aughts called Wanted with James McAvoy. And that wasn't a supernatural kind of movie, but it was sort of like a mystic superhero thing. And that movie is springing to mind because, on top of community and agency, I think we like these kinds of stories because they set up a situation of total moral clarity. There is a specific and eminently locatable evil in the world, and these characters are being called in to fight it directly and immediately. And there's no doubt that this task, that this approaching battle they're facing, is what matters most. It's their calling, it's their duty and their destiny, right? And for the characters in this kind of diegesis, there's no struggle to figure out the right thing to do or when and how to do it, or whether it supersedes the dreary urgency of needing to work the day job or pay the mortgage or mow the lawn. Now, these characters, they might be, weary or doubtful of themselves or afraid, but unlike most of the rest of us, they don't have to keep talking themselves into doing what needs doing, and they don't keep getting distracted by Instagram and cookies. I guess something like slaying a vampire king is kind of scary, sure, but some days I think it's maybe preferable to another day spent lying in the carpet, paralyzed by the horror of the world around us, to the point that you can, neither crack the code on ending homelessness nor summon the energy to start the dishwasher. Buffy's mission is really clear. And even though that might be super dangerous for her, I think it floats us a kind of relief, letting us into this sanctuary of total moral certainty and irrefutable, irresistible purpose that we never really get to experience in real life. And in that movie, Wanted, by the way, there's this great scene where the main character is sitting in his cubicle at work, doing a really mind numbing, pointless job and hating his life when Angelina Jolie just materializes unexpectedly and informs him that he, in fact, is a warrior with some kind of superhuman capability. And he's always been fated to join up with a band of other superhuman warriors to do good of some kind. I'm forgetting the details of this movie. I seem to recall that it includes some kind of a magic loom, I think, that weaves divine messages or instructions. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've seen it. But the cubicle scene is completely branded on my brain forever because it strikes me as this fantasy that most of us have probably had at some point. Like someone arriving or some force or event or thing arising that pulls us by force out of the mundane and plunges us into a role of hero with a clear purpose. I mean, it's really another version of the whole you're a wizard, Harry moment, right? And maybe there's just a little piece of each of us that's kind of waiting around to get called up to do something clear and meaningful in the fight against evil. Of course, the Hollywood version of evil is easily the most fun form of it. As far as real life spiritual and supernatural evil, well, I'm not here to make any declarative statements about the existence of any of that. I've never had any experience with it, and I don't know any more than anybody else. I guess I don't necessarily rule it out. I just don't have anything definitive or helpful to say about that kind of evil. But that leaves us with human forms of evil to kick around today. And I think most of us have come to terms with the idea that there is evil in the world. We think first maybe of the sort of undeniable cataclysmic version of that, genocides and war crimes and concentration camps and maybe serial killers too. But these seem far away. They're horrific historical anomalies. And if you have been privileged, as I have been, to be born and grow up in a relatively safe and stable region of the world in a relatively safe and stable time, this kind of landslide evil feels remote, like things that happen in other times and other places to other people. This is why I think any American over about 35 can remember exactly where they were on September 11th. It was an extraordinary shock to the system to see that kind of landslide evil slide directly over us here. And of course, there are other kinds of evil that are just as potent and just as repugnant, but more contained and with a smaller, concentrated scope. I'm thinking of murderers and abusers and assailants. These are points of evil that we know intellectually are peppered through the world around us, possibly even encroaching close around us, but we really hope we'll never intersect with them. I think for the most part, we sort of shield our eyes from these kinds of evil. And it doesn't pay to dwell on it overmuch, and you can't live a life of hope or optimism if the worst possible side of humanity is how you frame the world. But it's important to remember that these forces are out there stirring, they do exist, and not getting glib about them can help us protect ourselves. It can remind us of the need to listen to our self preservation instincts, to keep a watchful and protective eye over vulnerable people or entities, the young, the old, the ill, the disenfranchised. the animal world, the natural world, and on and on. So we can't dwell, but we can't get overly blasé about the existence and possibility of big, blistering malevolence at work in our world. But I think there are also smaller slivers of evil in the world that we're much more likely to come up against, in day to day business and maybe in ourselves that we need to stay on top of. And actually, I don't know if I'd say that we all have evil in us as like a permanently resident part of character. Maybe it's more ephemeral. Since I've been talking about scary movies, the idea of possession is kind of useful on a totally metaphorical level. Something that sort of drifts over us because of circumstance or mood or whatever and takes residence for a minute. And most of the time, I don't think we mean to be a host to something dark like that. We don't mean to go around shooting little evil slivers into other people's lives. It just happens sometimes. When we feel dark, we can make others feel darker still. And we may never know if we've done harm. Something happened to me way more than 20 years ago. And it wasn't by most measures a significant event, but I still remember every detail of it really vividly. I was trying to finish my bachelor's degree in English, shout out to EIU, and I was paying for it by working third shift at a job at a local phone company as a phone operator a million years ago when people still called the operator for directory assistance or for help placing a collect call. And I just realized that a whole generation just asked themselves, what's a collect call? Fair enough. You can Google that. Anyway, the point is, I was working 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 or sometimes even 6 times a week, and then taking classes during the day. And I was tired. I was vulnerable and I was tired. And on this particular day, I was really tired. I had struggled to stay awake driving in from my job in the next town over. I was so exhausted, I felt sort of sick. And I was having a moment of real doubt about whether I could keep it up for much longer. It was one of those mornings that you just sort of cry in the car because you're so overwhelmed. And it was right at the very start of the spring semester, the first week of classes, and I had to stop and pick up one of the books assigned for one of my new classes. And I walked into the textbook rental building in a kind of exhaustion fog. I went in through a random door and just kind of shuffled into the line of customers waiting where I thought the correct place was. I had neglected to notice that I had come in a side door instead of the main door, and the way that sort of positioned me, I didn't notice that there was actually a longer line of several people behind the woman I had just gotten in line behind. And they were all there around a corner waiting their turn to step up to the area where she was. It was a mistake, but I did cut several people off, but it was a complete accident. I didn't mean to do it. I wasn't aware I had done it. And if someone had politely explained what I had done, I would have just corrected my mistake. But the woman in front of me noticed me do this and got very upset. And she kind of whirled around and said, "Do you think you're in line here?" And I was really confused by her question and her tone because, again, I'm exhausted. And before I could even formulate an answer, she just broke bad on me, like brutally. She was like, "I guess you must be a really important person to think you can just cut in front of all these people who've been standing here for almost an hour waiting. What makes you such an important person?" And then she locked eyes with me and gave me this really intense stare and then looked me over super critically once and said, "Or is it that you don't feel like waiting your turn with a hangover? Look at you with your bloodshot eyes. You look like you need to go home and sober up and then try again." And this was like a 40-year-old woman, maybe, not just a mean girl co-ed or something. And I'll never forget her green eyes. She had these very intense, really quite beautiful pea green eyes. And I was so just shocked by the whole thing. I was embarrassed that I had cut a bunch of people off. I was totally humiliated that she was shouting at me in front of all these people who were probably just as annoyed with me as she was. I was really embarrassed and mortified about how rough I obviously looked after she said what she said. And I was just really disproportionately wounded by this unexpected unkindness that was just pouring over me suddenly when I hadn't intended to do anything offensive to anybody. It was pretty awful. And I think because I was so tired and so worn down anyway, I just had no defenses. So, this particular incident, which should have rolled off my back like nothing, just kind of cut me open and got inside me somehow, beyond all reason or proportion. In the moment, I couldn't even make myself go over and get in line in the proper place. I just walked out of textbook rental and across campus to my car, feeling like somebody had kicked me in the gut. And I cried all the way back to my apartment. And when I got home, I got online and I canceled all my classes. And it was a full year before I could re enroll. That incident, for some reason that I still can't quite explain, just gutted me and derailed me. Now, did I overreact to it? Of course, total overreaction. And that's because it probably wasn't even really about that exact incident. It was just a culmination. It was just about the fatigue and the self doubt and the financial struggle and overwork and all of that stuff that had been swirling around in my really tired head for a really long time. But it was just this right tiny thing at the exact wrong moment. But and I won't say she because she bears no responsibility here. It was sort of an accident, an incident, a catalyst. But it, as an event, really detoured my life for a little while, more than I should have ever allowed it to do. And I'm not 100% sure why, even now. And I've actually thought about that woman several times since then. And I imagine she was having her own kind of shit day. And she probably had been standing there for a long time, stewing, as we all do when we're in a line that's not moving and we're irritated about the time something's taken. And then I blundered in and pushed my way in right behind her, and it probably just set her off. And I'm sure her anger had very little to do with me. And I'm also completely sure that she had no intention of inflicting any real harm on anybody that day. I don't think she got up that morning and said, I would love to derail a struggling college kid who just came off an overtime graveyard shift. Of course she didn't. It was probably a momentary flare for her. Maybe she even felt bad about it afterward, who knows? But in that moment, without ever intending to be, she was just a little tiny puff of evil in that exact wrong moment in my life for a second. And I don't mean she herself was evil. I don't mean there was anything, supernatural afoot there. But human beings do harm sometimes without meaning to, without even really being responsible for it, I think. And that incident has made me wonder if, and, probably more to the point when, I have been that little puff of evil in other people's lives, that last straw that broke the camel's back, or that last little bit of salt that fell into a wound that became too much. I can be kind of generally ambiently cranky. And when I feel like a line has been crossed, I can also be quite pointed and sharp sometimes. I do far better now with my temper than I did when I was younger, but it's still a work in progress for me, this whole project of choosing kindness and patience more often than not. Most of us, I think, go through life not wanting to do harm to other people, but it takes work sometimes to move from no ill intent to actually doing no harm, from stopping myself from doing the things I'm naturally inclined to do if it risks others' feelings, actually pumping those brakes, developing that self control, cultivating more predictive awareness of the damage I might do before I open my mouth. That's work. And I don't always do it well. And I'm sure that there have been times in my life where I've been the one who wafts anger or bitterness or harm or maybe even unintentional evil into other people's lives at the exact worst moment. And that pains me. and it should pain me. And the awareness that our negative impacts can outstrip our will, I think that's a good tool to have. I think it's something to keep in the back of our minds as we bumble around in a crowded, tired world where we don't want to get too glib about the damage we may do. And I think that's especially true for us living in this particular moment in time because we have more reach than ever. We each have so many more broadcast channels and communication tools at our fingertips than any other individuals who have ever lived across the span of human history. We're still connected to our friends and our family and our colleagues and neighbors in all the same ways we've always been. But now we're also tethered to ever widening networks of acquaintances, friends of friends, resurrections of relationships that would have otherwise timed out or been severed by distance. We are connected in unprecedented ways, and we have completely unprecedented reach with our words and our attitudes because we brush up against multitudes of strangers and near strangers today in ways and volumes that are unprecedented in human history. I keep using that word, but it's the right word. In social posts and in comment sections, Reddit forums, LinkedIn stories, we have so much potential to leave our residue on so many people in so many ways every day. And sadly, a lot of these channels are not designed to foster kindness. In so many of these places, the worst of who we are is really invited to come out and play. And that's by design, that's by the algorithm, by technical engagement strategies. It's not an accident. The risk of becoming that little unintentional puff of evil, which maybe causes big pivotal harm, seems almost incalculable at this point. I have more to say about technologically mediated shittiness next week, actually, but I think it applies here today too. And actually, to loop it all back full circle, one of the lines in the TV show Evil that really hooked me was about the way that technology draws out the worst in us and connects it to the worst in others. There's a scene where two characters, I think, are at a bar and they're discussing exactly this kind of thing. And one says about social media, evil is organizing. And I don't think that's the whole story, but I also don't think it's wrong. Finally, I just want to close out by saying that, in my personal opinion, the greatest threat and possibly the greatest evil operating in our world right now lives in those forces, technological, cultural, sometimes collateral, but too often totally intentional, that are working to make us see each other as potentially evil. There are strengthening cultural currents that are pulling us into silos and factions far beyond the ways that we've always had divides in society that produced disagreement and debate. But to have productive disagreement and healthy debate, you have to have real discourse and genuine exchange. And we are rapidly, in my opinion, losing vital capacities for civil engagement that are necessary to discourse and to exchange, and thus for the problem solving and consensus building and relational repair, maybe conversations that should follow. Instead, things are increasingly framed as a zero sum game in which one party wins everything and one party loses everything. And although I have my own opinions, and I'm sure you do too, I'm not trying to make a partisan statement. I'm talking right now about a pervasive, invasive, bipartisan, if you want to label it that way, just general degradation in the overarching, overall way we all communicate, and not just about politics, but about just about everything. And one of the litmus tests left to us, I would argue, to sort of check out the presence of evil in the messages and the media and the communication strategies we're hearing is whether it leans into a fight between good and evil or proposes a stark dichotomy of right and wrong. Whereas those who stand on the wrong side of whatever issue aren't just mistaken in their beliefs, but somehow evil in their essence. Because while that kind of thing makes for a good TV show, out here in the real world, things are rarely black and white, and people are almost never easily or fairly divisible into good and otherwise. And human history teaches us pretty unequivocally and absolutely tragically that those who do great evil often start by applying exactly that label to others. So I think it's important for us in our small personal interactions, but also in our overarching approaches to public life and public discourse, to refuse to become glib about these forces of evil around us, and sometimes maybe in us, and more frequently embedded in the messaging and communications around us. Okay, then, that got kind of dark. Happy Halloween, and you're welcome. All right, so evil, don't get glib about it, whatever else you do this Halloween. That's about enough of this for the day. Thank you so much for spending some time with me, and I'll be back next week with thing number 31.